What if the deadliest natural disaster you could face made no sound at all? At Lake Nyos in Cameroon, about 1,746 people and thousands of animals died in a single night. Not from lava, not from an explosion, but from the air itself suddenly turning against them. So, before you get too comfortable, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've ever had an eerie experience with nature that stuck with you. And if quiet curiosity helps you wind down, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Now, dim the lights, maybe settle back, and let the night do the rest. A lake had been quietly storing carbon dioxide for decades until a single night let it all go. The result? Invisible death rolling silently through valleys and into homes. And Lake Nyos wasn't the first warning. 2 years earlier, a nearby lake offered a smaller, terrible sign of what was possible. This isn't folklore. It's real geology. And tonight, you're meeting a lake that looked harmless until the surface calm began to whisper otherwise. Imagine this. You are standing on the ridge above Lake Nyos. The water below is still enough that it seems to hold the night sky without a ripple. Your ears pick up only small, ordinary sounds. An owl calling from somewhere in the valley, the slow clink of a cowbell, the faint stretch of wood smoke from cooking fires drifting along the air. If you lived here, this scene wouldn't have unsettled you. The lake would have been part of the background of your life. Another source of water, a marker in the landscape, a place for animals to drink and children to play. To an outsider, it looked beautiful in the way many highland lakes do. To the villagers, it was familiar, steady, and safe. Lake Nyos filled a volcanic crater, what geologists call a maar, carved long ago by violent eruptions, but cooled and softened into green slopes and pastures. By the 1980s, the ring of cliffs and trees felt like part of daily rhythm. People fetched water, tended herds, and sat beneath trees along the shore. In daylight, the scene was calm and pastoral, smaller and less intimidating than the rivers in the lowlands. Its surface reflected hills and sky with a precision that seemed reassuring. If you've ever sat by a local pond on a warm night, expecting only small ripples and the hum of insects, you know the kind of normality it gave off. That everyday sense of safety was the very thing that made what followed unthinkable. The activities around the lake were simple. Chickens were brought in at dusk. Cows settled on the grass with their bells going quiet, one by one. The soundscape grew softer by the minute, dominated more by insects than by voices. For families nearby, the lake was no more threatening than the rain-fed fields around it. It meant water for drinking, fish for food, and a calm backdrop for evenings. To be near its edge was to feel normalcy. Ordinary life floated above the surface in complete ignorance of what the water trapped underneath. What lay out of sight was not the calm of shallow depths, but a body of water about 210 meters deep. That depth mattered more than anyone realized. Every 10 meters of water adds about 1 atmosphere of pressure. Multiply that by over 200 meters, and you have a huge compression chamber at the lake's base. This made it possible for carbon dioxide, seeping slowly from volcanic fissures below, to remain dissolved in the cold bottom layers. Year after year, the invisible gas trickled upward through rock pores and fractures, only to be swallowed by the lake's deep reservoir. cut off from circulation by the sharp layering of warm water on top and cold water below. It lingered there, silent and unseen. To a person living nearby, there were no signs of this process, no unusual smell, no bitter taste in the water, no bubbling on the surface. The atmosphere was peaceful. The gas had no color or scent that could betray itself. Life followed familiar cues, the end of field work, the quiet conversations after dusk, rest taken near a lake that seemed permanent, simple, and harmless. There were no instruments to measure dissolved gases or changing chemistry. Only the silence of the valley, the reflection of the moon, and the near certainty that this place had always been the same and would always remain so. It's unsettling to think how firmly ordinary life rested on that misreading. The deeper layers of the lake had been quietly storing gas as if a lid had been pressed down on a sealed jar. No one noticed. An odd chill near the shore could easily be mistaken for a natural breeze, nothing unusual for evening hours. The water's stillness, instead of hinting at danger, made the lake feel nourishing. The apparent normality concealed the truth, decades of invisible accumulation kept under lock by sheer pressure. The physics of Neos were working on their own schedule. A volcanic crater became a natural vault. The villagers recognized the surface, but not the hidden mechanics. People saw reflections of home and sky. Below, the lake held on to gas in amounts no small valley could withstand if suddenly freed. It was not false tranquility. It was real to human senses, but incomplete. The lake gave rhythm and sustenance during the day, while at the same time holding back a secret that no one would suspect. So when night fell, that August, nothing in the air suggested danger. The valley listened to the usual instruments of evening, cowbells quieting, chickens shuffling, insects humming. The surface looked ordinary, the same as any other night. But beneath that calm, carbon dioxide had been kept in place for years. Dense, invisible, compressed by depth. The stage was set without anyone knowing. So when night fell that August, the lake looked ordinary, but the physics beneath it had been keeping an impossible secret. How does water, something that feels harmless to the touch, end up hiding a force capable of suffocating whole valleys? That puzzle sits at the heart of Lake Neos. On an ordinary day, if you walked barefoot to its shore, you'd only notice the cool mud at your feet and a surface reflecting sky and grass. Nothing there would betray the fact that far beneath, carbon dioxide was seeping up from magma hidden in the crust. The gas entered invisibly, bubble by bubble, and instead of rising into open air, it dissolved quietly into the lake's bottom waters. It was as if the crater itself had been turned into a vessel drinking the slow exhalation of the earth beneath. No hiss, no sulfur smell, no strange foam. Just still water storing a breath too heavy for human lungs. The reason it could do this lies in the way a deep crater lake behaves. Neos stretches to about 210 meters at its deepest point. In such a basin, the water stacks itself in layers. Warm surface layers, stirred by sun, remain on top, while the cold, denser bottom stays sealed off. That separation is known as stratification, and it prevents full mixing. To villagers drawing pails, it meant nothing. The surface seemed perfectly normal. To the carbon dioxide rising from underground fissures, it meant entrapment. Beneath more than 20 atmospheres of pressure, the gas dissolved in concentrations far beyond what shallow waters ever hold. An image helps. like a shaken bottle sitting capped, stable as long as no one twists it open. The pressure of the lake itself formed the lid. Scientists later confirmed those deep waters were not just infused with gas, but heavily supersaturated, holding stores far greater than ordinary lakes could absorb. The upward seepage from magma never really stopped. Year after year, it added a fraction more to the chemical load below. Over decades, the balance shifted until much of Nios's lower half had become a hidden reservoir. No villager could see that threshold forming. Children swam in coves, fishermen placed nets in the shallows, cattle drank at edges, damp with grass. To taste it was to taste ordinary fresh water. The true contents belonged to pressure readings and instruments that had never been brought there. Carbon dioxide, unlike some volcanic gases, comes with no warning traits. It has no color, no smell, and no burn in the nose. It is not like rotten egg sulfur, which our senses would recoil from. That is partly why the trap was so complete. A person could stand by the shore breathing normally, hearing birds across the ridges, never imagining that the deeper column beneath their feet was filling with invisible weight. Only a scientific instrument could have revealed the buildup. Even scientists globally had little vocabulary for such an event. The phrase limnic eruption did not exist until after Nios forced its way into awareness. This wasn't the first time the phenomenon had occurred. In 1984, just 2 years earlier, Cameroon's smaller Lake Monoun released its own pulse of stored carbon dioxide. That earlier event killed 37 people, tragic but limited to nearby villagers. It offered a warning shot and proved the geology could behave this way. Yet, with little study and few instruments, the connection between Monoun and the ticking load at Nios wasn't yet obvious. The scale of Nios made what was a troubling oddity into a catastrophe waiting in silence. The scale is key to grasping why. Scientists estimated that the Lake Nios depths held gas quantities somewhere in the hundreds of thousands to potentially a few million tons, depending on the calculation. The uncertainty is wide, but in either case, it was enormous compared to the tiny trickle of gas our daily lives prepare us for. All of it compressed and held under stratification. Depth and pressure turned the lake into something more than a reservoir. It became a chamber. To outside eyes, though, none of it registered. Villages lay below in valleys, trusting a water source that looked reliable. Even more unnerving, no obvious changes marked the slow priming of the system. Bodies of livestock grazed peacefully right next to its banks. Children waded in shallows at dusk, setting baskets or washing feet. People drank the same water every morning. The layers holding carbon dioxide remained pinned at depth, stabilized by pressure, silent in chemistry. Everything that would later prove fatal remained invisible until something disturbed the balance. That patience of accumulation and that absence of warning is what makes the story feel almost impossible. By the mid-1980s, scientists now agree that Nios had collected enough gas to make its lower layers dangerously unstable. Once water is supersaturated, a disturbance can release dissolved carbon dioxide as a torrent of bubbles. Why the release finally happened at exactly that time remains unsolved. Several hypotheses exist: a landslide slipping into the water, subsurface seismic activity, or even heavy rainfall temporarily altering the layering. Each possibility could have stirred the locked depths, overturning the water enough to break equilibrium. The precise cause may never be known. What matters is that the lake held more than its bottom water could safely contain, and once disturbed, it had no way to hold it back. That silenced imbalance left Nios like a bottle of soda resting indefinitely, pressurized beyond safety. For years, no hand had twisted the cap, no force had toppled it off the shelf. But in physical terms, the cap was incredibly delicate, the overlying layers of warm, unmixed water. Once breached, the water beneath would not release gently. It would erupt in a chain reaction. Gas rising, pressure falling, gas rising faster still. A runaway escape. For villagers, there was nothing visible to suggest this approach. They went about their evenings carrying water, settling cattle, lighting fires. To them, lakes held fish, not breath. Volcanoes meant glowing peaks far away, not clear reflections at their feet. The way Nios stored decades of volcanic gas lay completely outside everyday language. It was not ignorance. It was simply that no warning signs existed for human senses. The system remained balanced right up to the hour it tipped. In hindsight, the convergence of factors feels almost engineered in its precision. A volcanic crater, sealed deep with water. Magma below, leaking invisible gas. Steady stratification, preventing mixing. Pressure, compressing accumulation. Remove one of those, and the lake may never have triggered. All standing together, they produced a hidden mechanism primed to overturn. It looked like a pastoral stage, but it was, in reality, a silent trap wired by natural chemistry. When scientists visited afterward, they described it as a loaded gun or a time bomb. The analogy is imperfect because the lake was never malicious. It was simply obeying physical laws. Gas dissolves under pressure, layers hold until stirred, and once released, larger volumes climb irresistibly. But the effect for those living nearby was indistinguishable from the most carefully timed disaster. Calm water above, dense death below, waiting for an instigator. The questions linger even now. Why that August night, not the year before or the year after? Why Nios, when thousands of crater lakes exist worldwide? The answer may be chance. Local rainfall, a buried slump, a gas surge from the depths. But chance intersected with a system already beyond safe balance. Once the trigger arrived, the results followed with no further barrier. On the surface, that summer evening passed with all the usual cues of safety. Voices fell quiet, lamps flickered in huts, livestock rested in their corrals. Beneath, invisible stores of volcanic breath had reached their limit. Whatever disturbance finally nudged them upward set everything else in motion. And what came next would not look like fire or thunder. It would not sound like rock cracking or lava spewing. It began with something almost worse, an absence. For those sleeping in the villages below, the first sign was not noise, but silence more absolute than they had ever known. What followed was the night the air itself seemed to vanish. The night it happened, many families around Lake Nios were deep in sleep. Nothing rattled roofs or shattered windows. There was no glow of firelight, no tremor underfoot. What changed was the air itself. From beneath the calm lake, decades of stored carbon dioxide suddenly broke free. Some theories point to a small landslide or a shift in the layers of water that unbalanced the system. Whatever the trigger, once the gas began its escape, it rose in a rush and burst across the surface of the lake before spreading outward into the valleys. The cloud it created was dense and heavy. Carbon dioxide weighs more than the oxygen and nitrogen in ordinary air, which meant that instead of rising, it crept low to the ground. Guided by the shape of the land, it flowed down gullies and across pastures, pressing itself tightly into the valleys. Imagine a flood, but one you could not see, where doors and windows offered no protection, because the threat was not water or flame, but the very air already inside. In houses where people had lain down to sleep, the night passed without stir. Many did not wake. Survivors later recalled that it was not terror or noise that struck. Some described a lightheaded feeling, then an irresistible drowsiness, as if sleep rushed in without warning. For a few, that drowsiness shifted into unconsciousness so swiftly that there was no time to cry out or rouse others. The sensation was closer to drifting off gently than to panic. When those same survivors opened their eyes again, hours had passed, and the world around them had changed completely. The usual morning sounds, voices, animal calls, the clatter of daily chores were absent. They woke into an awful silence that was more frightening than any noise. What they found was a landscape that looked unchanged at first glance. The hills still stretched green. The lake reflected clear sky. Homes still stood. But the life that usually animated these valleys was missing. Houses were unnaturally still. Animals lay across fields without movement. Whole stretches of village seemed hushed, as if the day had been paused. Those who had been higher on the slopes sometimes realized only later what had occurred, when they looked down into the valley and noticed something unfamiliar in its stillness. Eventually, stepping downhill meant entering the space where oxygen had been replaced. A few people collapsed again upon crossing that invisible threshold, realizing only later how close they had come to being lost as well. The uncanny thing is what the gas did, and what it did not. It left no structural damage, no fire swept through kitchens, no quakes toppled walls. Fields were not washed away. The quiet devastation came only from air turned unbreathable. The scale, however, was vast. Scientists later calculated that enormous amounts of carbon dioxide were released in a single burst. It spread silently across the lowlands, suffocating people, cattle, and even birds that had roosted too low in the valleys. In total, around 1,746 people died, along with thousands of animals. It was not only the scale that stunned observers, but the way it happened. Life ended in stillness rather than violence. That quiet is what survivors remembered most vividly. One later said it was like waking into a dream where the world had been emptied overnight. The absence of chatter, of footsteps, of the small sounds of morning work cut more deeply than any roar could have. The valley felt whole in appearance, but hollow in spirit. The tragedy did not break the landscape. It drained it. And in that drained silence, loss was everywhere. Grief mixed with disbelief, because nothing looked like a disaster zone. People were gone, but their surroundings remained as if untouched. This rare phenomenon eventually received a name: a limnic eruption. At the time, scientists had no word for what had occurred. Only 2 such events have ever been recorded. First at Lake Manoon in 1984, then here at Lake Nyos in 1986. Their rarity underscores why the event took communities and scientists alike by surprise. No one could have imagined a lake releasing its contents like a sudden exhalation, transforming air into something unfit for life. It was as though the ground itself had rewritten the rules of danger. The event left questions in its wake. Was this a volcanic eruption without lava? A poisonous cloud like those that sometimes escape fumaroles? Or was it something else altogether? Something new that demanded a scientific category of its own? In the aftermath, investigators traveled to Nios bringing instruments and theories. They measured gases, studied the layering of the lake, and asked whether communities elsewhere might live above similar risks without knowing it. What they discovered would deepen our understanding not just of this lake, but of how fragile the boundary is between breathable air and suffocating stillness. And yet, beyond the scientific interest, the human mystery lingered. Survivors struggled to describe what it felt like to breathe in air that was suddenly not air at all. They remembered the confusion of trying to speak and producing only silence, the strange way sleep took them without resistance, and the haunting quiet when they reawakened. These experiences made the tragedy especially difficult to convey. It was not the chaos people usually imagine in disaster. It was its opposite. That calm disguise is what makes the story both deeply unsettling and unforgettable. After this strange night, the question remained: how could air vanish in a place where everything else seemed untouched? Scientists had to learn not only what forced the lake to release its hidden burden, but also what that sudden change did inside the human body. They wanted to know how lives could end so gently, so swiftly, and with so little alarm. Their instruments gave a surprising answer, one that begins not in the sky or the lake, but within the rhythm of every breath. What happens inside us when the breath we take in is no longer life-giving air, but something else? On the night at Lake Nios, lungs filled as they always had, chest muscles moved as usual, but what entered was carbon dioxide in overwhelming amounts. Survivors later described trying to inhale deeply, even yawning, yet none of it brought oxygen. The cruel twist was that the air felt ordinary. There was no warning burn, no smoke to trigger coughing. Pathologic studies carried out afterward pointed clearly to one cause: death by asphyxiation from carbon dioxide. Victims had lost consciousness quickly as oxygen levels collapsed. Under normal conditions, the balance is delicate but reliable. Oxygen molecules drift into alveoli in the lungs, pass into red blood cells, and bind to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin then ferries oxygen out to every organ. Carbon dioxide, as a waste product, flows the other direction, out of cells, into the blood, and back to the lungs to be exhaled. This exchange depends entirely on air being rich in oxygen. Replace that with high concentrations of carbon dioxide, and the system stalls. No matter how rhythmically the muscles continue to breathe, what enters the bloodstream cannot feed life. The body's first signs of trouble are subtle. Survivors recalled dizziness, heaviness, or overwhelming sleepiness that arrived almost instantly. Some mentioned that the air seemed oddly thick or carried strange odors like sulfur. Later analysis showed the gas was overwhelmingly carbon dioxide, nearly odorless, so the reports of bad smells may have been illusions, hallucinations brought on by the brain under stress from rising CO2. Medically, this makes sense. As carbon dioxide increases in blood, acidity rises. Nerves misfire. The brain can produce false impressions, including imagined smells, just as it can under anesthesia or oxygen deprivation. What made this suffocation so deceptive was its lack of panic. We expect breathlessness to bring frantic gasps, but with sudden high CO2, consciousness can fade too swiftly for alarm. The gas dulls the nervous system before signals of danger can even register. People may have reached to call out or stand up, but those efforts withered almost immediately. Several survivors explained later that they tried to form words, but nothing emerged. The voice itself slipped away before the mind could use it. This muffling of both awareness and communication meant households faced the change alone, unable to rouse neighbors, even if they knew something was wrong. That silence shaped the disaster in a haunting way. Medical comparisons to anesthesia are apt. Patients in surgery breathe calmly into a mask, drift into unconsciousness, and afterward recall no moment of passing out. In Nios, whole families lay where they had settled for the night, appearing only to have slept too long. There was no outward fight. Adults, children, cattle, all collapsed with a similar stillness. Chairs were not overturned. Tools were not scattered. The asphyxiation was thorough, but eerily calm, as if life had been paused rather than extinguished. Inside the body, though, processes unraveled quickly. The accumulation of carbon dioxide drives blood toward acidity. Enzymes falter, muscles tire. Without oxygen in red blood cells, the brain starves within minutes. Loss of consciousness follows swiftly, and without recovery of air composition, organs shut down step by step. From the outside, to those who later investigated, it appeared as a field of sleepers. Inwardly, it was cellular suffocation, the smallest levels of biology failing without signaling alarm. For people who managed to wake hours later, memories came only in fragments. They described dizziness, a sudden blank space, then the surreal experience of opening their eyes into a world where the usual sounds of morning were gone. That amnesia, too, echoes surgical anesthesia, a slice of time removed altogether. In their case, the reprieve came only because the carbon dioxide cloud eventually thinned, rolling onward or dissipating into surrounding air. A few villagers revived with lasting injuries, respiratory irritation, lingering weakness, even long-term complaints recorded later by medical teams who followed up. Survival did not always mean full restoration. The gas left scars that were quiet, but real. The picture across the valley was repeated over and over again. Livestock that had bedded in fields were stilled in place. Poultry in coops slumped in silence. Herds of cattle, vital to local families, were gone in entire groups, yet nothing around them was changed. Grass remained upright, huts remained intact. It emphasized how peculiar the force was. Air itself had shifted just enough to undo breath, but too gently to disturb the physical scene. That deception made the scale of loss harder for outsiders to believe at first. How could life end everywhere without marks of struggle? The truth lay in that biological paradox. You breathe deeply, but oxygen fails to arrive. Your chest moves, your lungs inflate, but at the cellular level, suffocation proceeds anyway. The villagers had no frame of reference for such an event. Fire kills by burning, water by drowning, earthquakes by collapse. But here, it was the quiet chemistry of inhalation that was undone. It is unsettling to recognize how much is built upon the assumption that each breath carries the right mixture of gases. Change it, even slightly, and the entire system of life disintegrates quietly. By the time dawn broke, the mystery carried both scientific and human weight. Families were found in postures of rest, their bodies giving the impression of having simply continued sleeping. Investigators later confirmed that asphyxia, induced by carbon dioxide, was the cause. calm appearances masked rapid collapse inside. To witnesses, this calmness was almost unbearable, because it looked like life paused, not violently ended. The science explained the chemistry, but perception on the ground was of a valley where time had stopped for nearly everyone. What made the night so uncanny was exactly this: the stillness of bodies, the neatness of homes, the unscorched land. From the outside it resembled peace, yet biology had been secretly rewritten by gas. It was no wonder that first reports left experts baffled. Something had killed thousands, silently and without trace of violence. And as shock spread, the next great question surfaced. If it was not a volcano erupting fire, and not a human accident of chemicals, what could turn a lake into a silent killer? In the hours after the catastrophe, with shock still hanging like mist over the valleys, the first investigations began. Officials, doctors, and scientists moved toward Lake Nyos, carrying with them rumors that had already spread through Cameroon. An eruption, a secret weapon, even hints of curses. What they saw on arrival confounded all those ideas. Entire households had been stilled, animals lay across pastures, yet houses and fields stood without damage. No ash, no scorched soil, no collapsed roofs. The stillness seemed impossible to reconcile with anything they had seen in past disasters. The obvious first thought was volcanic. This was, after all, a crater lake sitting squarely on volcanic ground in a region shaped by old eruptions and lava fields. Villagers were accustomed to tremors and smoke across the mountains. The idea that Nyos itself had erupted made intuitive sense, and yet, on close inspection, it fell apart. Scientists found no new lava pouring down slopes, no cinders, no trees singed at the roots. The lake sat eerily calm except for a reddish tinge in its waters. In the usual checklist of a volcanic blast, nothing matched. For specialists trained to read eruption scars, the missing signs stood out immediately. That gap led to alternative guesses. Perhaps this was human in origin, a chemical spill, a hidden warehouse of gas or pesticides released by accident. The scene resembled mass poisoning more than any eruption. People felled mid-step, livestock collapsed simultaneously. No fire, no quake, no visible destruction. Yet surveys showed the land was farmland and pasture, not industrial. No factory or storage depot had lurked nearby. And so this line, too, quickly reached a dead end. What investigators did notice, with instruments that detected air composition, was carbon dioxide. Even days afterward, pockets of it lingered close to the soil. Concentrations were far above safe levels. That finding reframed the mystery. Could the killer have been not fire, nor chemicals, but the atmosphere itself, altered suddenly by the lake? The notion was unsettling, but began to fit what they observed. People and animals taken silently, the landscape unharmed, buildings intact. To geologists and chemists, it was a startling prospect. Carbon dioxide was no stranger. It pours from every breath we exhale, every cooking fire we light. But at Nyos, they now considered it on a far larger scale. Gas streamed from magma deep in earth, dissolved silently into cold lake waters at depth, stored under pressure for years. Then, some trigger had let it erupt all at once. It explained how valleys could lose oxygen so swiftly, and crucially, it reminded them of another event nearby. In 1984, Lake Monoun, another crater lake in Cameroon, had killed about 37 people in a smaller but similar outpouring. At the time, that tragedy was labeled mysterious. Now, with Nyos, the pattern could not be ignored. The scientific debate sharpened. Some experts remained convinced Nios had suffered a phreatic blast, a kind of volcanic steam eruption, invisibly venting. Others argued the evidence fit better with a limnic event, where deep, gas-laden water overturns and releases its load. The discussion stretched into conferences, culminating in 1987, when an international group, meeting in Yaoundé, pored over the data. They weighed testimonies, air samples, and water chemistry, noting just how saturated the lake's depths had become. Gradually, the balance tipped. Although not everyone agreed quickly, the weight of measurements pointed toward a limnic eruption as the most likely cause. To fix a name to it was to admit that lakes themselves could erupt, not with lava, but with suffocating air. This was a shock at the time. For centuries, recorded disasters emphasized the violent: lava, earthquakes, floods, storms. The idea that a tranquil lake, with no visible warning or noise, could kill thousands through chemistry alone required new vocabulary. Limnic eruption entered the lexicon because of Nios, a rare, almost alien kind of hazard, yet one both simple in mechanism and devastating in result. The Manoon case, once seen as a localized oddity, was reclassified as an early warning. Together, they constituted a phenomenon that could no longer be dismissed. Scientists returning to work on the lake treated it as both danger and laboratory. They measured gas profiles layer by layer, confirming deep saturation. They modeled how such eruptions build and cascade. Limnology, once a quieter science of lakes and water flow, suddenly bore the weight of explaining deaths on a massive scale. For locals, this brought little comfort. Knowledge alone did not prevent recurrence. Families still lived in valleys nearby. Herds still grazed along the shores. Another overturn could, in principle, happen at any moment. Out of this tension, tragedy on one side, data on the other, came the central realization: the lake itself was the silent killer. Carbon dioxide had accumulated invisibly at great depth, waiting for a trigger. A landslide, perhaps, or rain or seismic stirrings had been enough to unleash it. The cause and the scale were now understood. The next step had to be clear thinking about prevention. If still water could harbor such a reservoir, then calm itself was no reassurance. Investigators left Nios with two certainties. Lakes could kill without eruption or fire, and monitors alone would not shield communities. Something more active was necessary. The problem became practical. If a calm lake could kill like this, the urgent question became, can we prevent it from happening again? And how? Instead of speculating endlessly over why the eruption had occurred, scientists now had to face reality. If Lake Nios could hide death once, it could hide it again. That realization set engineers to work on one of the strangest projects in recent memory, designing a way for a lake to breathe. Not with lungs, of course, but through pipes that would let it exhale continuously, bit by bit, instead of storing up catastrophe for another night. The idea, when described quickly, sounded straightforward. Lift deep, gas-rich water to the surface in a steady stream, let the carbon dioxide bubble off harmlessly into the air, and, in doing so, prevent decades of invisible buildup. In practice, almost every step was complex. The lake sits high, in remote terrain, reached only by winding roads that crumble into dirt tracks. Every length of pipe, every anchor, and every pump had to be dragged in with painstaking labor. And there was a risk that unnerved everyone. Tampering with deep water could destabilize the very layers keeping carbon dioxide locked down, creating the very outburst the engineers meant to prevent. The final solution was starkly simple: vertical pipes anchored into the lake, dropping far into the deepest waters. Once water was pumped up, pressure dropped as the column rose. That pressure drop forced gas to bubble out, making the water inside the pipe lighter, which in turn drove more upward flow. With that change in density, the system became self-sustaining. It only needed the smallest initial push before natural buoyancy kept the siphon going. People began to describe it with a metaphor that stuck: a giant straw placed into the lake, venting a little at a time so the entire valley didn't have to face another suffocating exhalation all at once. Even knowing the theory, installing the first pipe required years of hesitation. Imagine testing a bottle of soda you know is badly shaken. You want to release the gas, but one wrong move could send it foaming in a rush. Scientists approached NIOS with that caution. Feasibility studies began in the 1990s, slow in part because bringing equipment into the rugged highlands took immense effort, but equally because of fear. Each stage of planning was haunted by the question of whether inserting a pipe could trigger the very runaway eruption it sought to prevent. That caution stretched into years of preparation. Trial systems were tested first, pulling only small volumes of water to prove the principle without stirring too much at once. Not until 2001, 15 years after the disaster, was the first permanent degassing pipe installed. To locals watching from the shore, the first rising plume of bubbles may have looked insignificant, a faint gurgle at the surface, a ribbon of water fizzing as if in slow motion. But for scientists, it was proof that NIOS could be coaxed into breathing safely. Gas escaped, people lived their day as usual, and catastrophe never arrived. Relief was visible on their faces. A single straw wasn't enough. The lake's depth and volume meant gases had accumulated in staggering amounts, and one outlet could only skim small fractions from the reservoir. Over the next decade, more pipes were added, each anchored carefully, tuned for the right angle and depth. By 2011, several degassing columns were working in unison, quietly venting the accumulated gas. Then, by around 2019, researchers reported the system had reached a steady state. The combination of pipes now maintained gas levels low enough to be considered safe, as long as the system kept running. Standing on the shore today, you might not notice the pipes immediately. Steel and plastic drop into the water, held in place by buoys. Stay long enough, and you'll hear a soft rush, like a kettle venting steadily, and see a faint plume rising. It isn't dramatic, but that's the point. The once hidden killer now leaves in a slow sigh, merging into the wind without fanfare. For the people farming nearby, it has become a background sound that reassures more than it distracts. Safety here hums instead of roars. The engineering is remarkable not for spectacle, but for humility. No gleaming towers, no massive concrete, just pipes, clamps, and quiet persistence. Yet it turns a lethal lake into something survivable. Where once volcanic water chemistry set a trap, human design now steadily undoes it. The lake no longer waits to betray the valley with a single, lethal release. Instead, it bleeds its burden slowly into the sky in amounts the atmosphere easily disperses. Even with results visible on the surface, anxiety persisted. Remote maintenance remains a real challenge. Seasonal rains could damage equipment. storms might drag anchors loose. Political or financial disruptions could stop the careful upkeep the pipes demand. And always, there was the unease that if anything went wrong during installation, the delicate stratification could unravel in dangerous ways. For that reason, testing continued cautiously. But each year, without incident, built confidence. Now, decades on, people can point to the single undeniable outcome. Since degassing began, Nyos's stored gas has been greatly reduced, and no repeat lethal event has occurred. It's an unusual achievement, modest structures protecting entire valleys. Unlike new power plants or highways, these pipes don't announce themselves with size or shine. They whisper on the surface of a lake, unseen much of the time, but reshaping life below. Villages that once scattered or moved away have slowly returned. Herds graze again, and fields are cultivated nearby. People live with the quiet reassurance that their lake is breathing daily under supervision, not hiding silent danger beneath. The success, though, doesn't erase every threat. Degassing addresses the chemistry inside the water, not the shape holding that water in place. Along the rim of Nyos, a natural dam of volcanic debris has stood for thousands of years, weathered and weakening. And some researchers caution that while the lake now breathes safely, the wall surrounding it may still pose challenges of its own. What draws attention now is not the water's hidden gas, but the ridge of earth and stone holding it in place. Lake Nyos exists because, thousands of years ago, a natural dam of volcanic debris formed across the valley. That barrier, made of unconsolidated pyroclastics, porous and weathered over millennia, acts less like solid bedrock and more like rubble set by time. Engineers recognized this fragility early on, and alongside degassing efforts, they began stabilizing the dam itself. One key method was jet grouting, drilling into the structure and injecting a cement-like slurry to bind the stones and bolster the wall's strength. These measures, supported by international partners, brought reinforcement where nature alone could not. From above, the dam doesn't appear dramatic. Rising about 40 meters, it tapers unevenly, its slopes greened with grass and shrubs. To a casual visitor, it resembles an ordinary hillside, but this irregular rise is the natural plug holding back millions of cubic meters of water at high elevation. Decades of tropical rains and surface streams have carved channels into its sides, leaving visible weathering. Geologists inspecting it noted that the material is friable. Pieces break easily once handled. The comparison, more than once, was to a sandcastle enduring tide and weather, only as long as balance permits. The pipes have managed the carbon dioxide hazard, but another truth remains. A sudden failure of the dam could release both forces at once. Studies show gas still lingers, though at low, stable concentrations. If water rushed out in a single breach, the violent drawdown could overturn remaining deep layers, releasing gas together with the flood itself. Even with degassing, a sudden collapse of the natural dam could combine floodwater release with overturn of deep water and pose a compound hazard. That interaction is why the dam's stability has never been treated as a minor issue. It is a core part of the safety plan for those valleys. The practical risks are clear. A major breach would mean billions of liters of water surging through settlements downstream. Unlike slow-moving floods from seasonal rises, this would offer little warning. Water would carry soil, rock, and trees in minutes, running the valleys bare. And if gas erupted, with it, the twin assault of water and suffocating air could devastate across borders. Villages stretching toward Nigeria could be in the path. Farms uprooted without time for organized evacuation. These factors gave urgency to reinforcement projects once the degassing program had shown progress. Jet grouting represented an attempt to bind the dam from within. Crews tested soil, guided pipes deep into the unstable matrix, and injected a strengthening mixture. Reports from the field described a loud, mechanical landscape: compressors, hoses, cement pumps, set against silence otherwise graced only by cattle and wind. The intervention reduced seepage and secured weak sections. It was never a full reconstruction, but it pressed coherence into what had been loosened material. Other smaller works followed. Surface drainage channels to guide rainfall away from weak slopes, protective coverings on erosion-prone flanks. Monitoring has continued steadily. Geologists measure seepage lines, record gradual movements, and sweep the slopes with modern instruments. Sensors track slight shifts, and satellites provide repeated imaging. The dam has not failed, and interventions improved its stability. Yet none of this can erase uncertainty. Natural materials weather constantly. Heavy tropical storms still drive water across the slopes. The dam will always remain more fragile than engineered masonry, simply because of what it is and how it formed. Governments and research groups, including regional and international collaborations, remain committed to watching it closely. Communities living downstream hold that awareness uneasily. In local memory, one disaster has already struck. Villagers who now hear the hiss of degassing know air is guarded, but they also know water presses behind a wall that speaks only through small slips and damp stains. Seasonal rains intensify those trickles, staining rock darker and leaving fine sediment as evidence of internal flow paths within the dam. People are told of instruments and measurements that specialists reassess frequently. Both reassurance and caution come with those facts. The risk is managed, but management is a continuing occupation, not a final repair. The mitigation efforts remind us that hazards rarely exist in isolation. Degassing reduced a chemical burden hidden beneath calm water. Jet grouting and slope reinforcements reduced mechanical risk in the dam. These strands, scientific and engineering, must work together, because at NEOS, one hazard amplifies the other. That recognition shaped the long-term program. Keep the lake exhaling safely, and keep the dam from losing its form. Both tasks require resources, attention, and the continuity of local and global cooperation. It's worth pausing on the idea of monitoring. Specialists from Cameroon, supported by international institutions, survey and report regularly. Gas concentrations are sampled, dam slope integrity mapped, seepage volumes recorded. These efforts form a quiet network of vigilance, unseen by most, but central to why people in surrounding villages can live and farm again. The good news is that no evidence points to imminent collapse, and mitigation has strengthened the dam considerably. The ongoing watch is a reminder that resilience is dynamic. Protections last only when observed and maintained. To the untrained eye walking along NEOS's rim, the scene doesn't suggest high hazard. The lake's surface reflects hills. Cattle graze nearby. Children play. But specialists do not rely on surface calm. They read erosion lines and stress pathways, situating the lake in centuries-long conversation with water, rock, and weather. From their perspective, safety is an active process. Pipes need inspection. Grout needs testing. Data requires updating. There is no single finish line where vigilance can be declared complete. The fragility of the natural dam reveals something broader about natural hazards. They rarely disappear entirely. We engineer controls, we reinforce weak points, but we continue to coexist with material that is not permanent. The dam stands as a reminder of that partnership. Many hazards of Earth demand this form of attention, where management replaces eradication. The durability of our settlements depends on sustained watching, not just one-time acts. And so, while the immediate danger of gas has been addressed and the fragility of the dam acted upon, the human story remains entwined with uncertainty. Families resettled, herds returned, schools reopened. But behind daily life is the knowledge that home sits beneath a lake and a dam that must be managed indefinitely. That kind of coexistence shapes how communities think about risk, memory, and future planning. What remains striking is how the lake's legacy doubles back into ordinary life. Even after technical teams declared reductions in gas and proclaimed the dam safer, the land did not reset. Families who once lost everything did not automatically regain stability. Physical safety was only one part of the recovery. Behind pipes and grout were people adapting to survival beyond geology. Because surviving the night of still air did not mean life was simple afterward. Risk shifted toward infrastructure and vigilance. But for survivors who woke that morning into silence, their challenges took new forms: grief, displacement, and the difficult work of rebuilding homes where their villages had been. The disruption carried into everyday life in ways far beyond the lake itself. Survivors, though alive, were suddenly without fields, herds, or the familiar structures that framed normal existence. Kitchens fell silent, not from lack of fire, but from the absence of people who had once tended them. Courtyards where families had gathered at dusk were empty. The landscape looked whole: green slopes, calm water, but its human fabric had unraveled. In the hours after the eruption, the challenge shifted from immediate safety to the uncertainty of how life could continue. Governments and aid groups organized resettlement for those who remained. Temporary shelters came first, then more formal camps established in the months that followed. Several thousand were displaced, spread across multiple sites. In design, they were meant to provide safety from any repeat event and stability in food and shelter. In reality, they marked another rupture. Villages were more than dots on a map. They were networks of fields, kinship, and memory. Once broken apart, those webs were hard to restore. Families found themselves assigned to different places, sometimes separated by administrative decision, sometimes by simple shortages of room. The promise of safety came with the cost of dislocation. Imagine arriving in one of these permanent resettlement areas. Houses were built in straight lines, roofed with corrugated metal, laid out in grids more reminiscent of military order than local tradition. For children, it may have seemed novel, a place of new routines, but adults recognized the loss. No trees shading ancestral compounds, no shrines to mark generations, unfamiliar soils that carried no stories of their own. Where once villages curved organically around paths and landmarks, the new spaces felt temporary, even as they were outlined as permanent. The ground may have been safe from gas, but it was unfamiliar ground all the same. This unfamiliarity extended into daily work. In Neos itself, Fertile fields sloped outward in recognition, each plot known by history and agreement. In the new camps, boundaries were not as clear or respected. Land was limited, and disputes emerged quickly. Crops were trampled. Goats grazed where they should not. Without shared lineage or ancestral claims, arguments carried sharper edges. Survival required negotiation with neighbors, who often shared little past connection. For families who had lost their herds and were forced to depend on sowing again, every square meter mattered. Tensions rose, not because people were unwilling, but because geography and memory no longer aligned. Economic systems stumbled under the strain. Herds had perished in overwhelming number during the night of gas. Cattle had not been simply animals, but wealth, nourishment, and the foundation of household security. To lose them was to lose status as well as livelihood. Rebuilding required years, yet grazing land was scarce in the new places. Some shifted into fuel wood collection, casual day labor, or dependence on aid. Self-sufficiency, which had framed valley life for generations, was fragmenting. Food moved by trucks rather than networks of barter. Assistance buffered households, but also reminded them that independence once taken for granted was now fragile. Not all was despair. Communities reorganized, often with quiet resilience. Water points were redug, schools built, markets reestablished, sometimes with NGO involvement, sometimes by local initiative. Outside groups helped install wells and improve access to medicine. These efforts never fully erased hardship, but they showed an important truth. Survivors were not passive in their circumstances. They found ways to adapt, to teach children, to mark new sites with meaning. Daily life continued even in landscapes that never felt entirely theirs. Years later, a new complication emerged. Political violence in Cameroon swept through the region, especially during the Anglophone crisis in the northwest. Some resettlement camps lay within contested areas, exposing families who had already endured one disaster to yet another round of disruption. Schools closed abruptly. Farming was interrupted. For people already removed from ancestral valleys, the sense of being dislocated twice, first by nature, then by human conflict, was heavy. Stability remained elusive, and the rebuilding that had begun was weakened again. Amid these shifting grounds, survivors carried a long awareness of being noticed only in fragments. Journalists returned on notable anniversaries. Researchers visited with instruments at the lake, measuring gases and monitoring the dam. These became the visible symbols of international response. In contrast, the communities themselves often felt remembered only intermittently. Their lives continued in daily rhythms of scarcity, resilience, and quiet endurance, largely unseen. To wake into safety from the lake, but into the thinness of chronic neglect, became the paradox of their survival. Generational effects deepened the mark. Children growing up in resettlement camps inherited stories of valleys and herds they would never see. For them, memory became a kind of absence. Fields described but not walked, traditions transplanted imperfectly to new soil. What to their parents felt like loss, to them became identity defined in camps rather than in valleys. Resilience was there too. They developed new networks, new skills, and ties to schools or NGOs that came intermittently. Yet the continuity of place had been ruptured, leaving them as both inheritors of the past and architects of something untested. This is the shadow of disaster across decades. It does not stay contained to the hours of its occurrence. It ripples through society, through politics, through generational identity. The carbon dioxide eruption ended in a night, but the consequences populated years. Land disputes, economic strain, cultural relocation, and political instability redefined survival in ways less visible than the catastrophe itself. Over time, conversations about resilience grew to recognize these lasting effects. Some spoke not of safety in purely physical terms, pipes venting the lake and grout reinforcing the dam, but of safety as wholeness. To live with dignity meant not only shelter, but belonging. Not only land, but land to which one was attached. Not only food, but the security to provide it oneself. Aid mattered, but without restored networks of community, the feeling of being perpetually unsettled endured. Nevertheless, within these constraints, communities expressed lasting strength. Farmers found ways to work within limits. Markets adapted. Religious and cultural traditions were practiced even when shrines or ancestral compounds were gone. Aid organizations noted not only the needs, but the capacities of survivors. Schools and camps, often staffed with local teachers, became centers of continuity and hope. Water points tapped shallow aquifers, sometimes improved by NGOs, providing both necessity and a sense of shared achievement. These touches of normalcy are not dramatic, but they are real, and they illuminate the tenacity of survival. Resettlement after Nios illustrates both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of human systems. Natural catastrophe struck suddenly, removing not only breath, but patterns of life. The response rebuilt some structures, but created new strains. Survivors carried both burdens and virtues through decades, living in conditions less visible to the world's eye, but no less instructive. It is not a story of passive waiting, but one of continued effort in landscapes that remain difficult. And beneath these human narratives lies a larger question. If one lake could erase communities so completely in a night, what of other lakes in other places, where gases build invisible reservoirs even now? Survivors of Nios remind us that a disaster is never only natural. It is woven into society afterward. The unanswered prospect is whether lessons taken here might prepare others before the same silence arrives elsewhere. Was Lake Nios a single cruel accident, or part of something larger hiding in the landscape? That was the question scientists asked once they understood what had happened during that hushed night in 1986. As startling as the disaster was, it wasn't the first time a Cameroonian lake had turned on its neighbors. 2 years earlier, in 1984, Lake Manoon, smaller and less known, had experienced a sudden outflow of carbon dioxide that killed about 37 people. At first, Manoon was treated as a puzzling anomaly, something curious but isolated. After Nios followed with far greater loss, the link became undeniable. These lakes could suffocate entire valleys without flame or flood. Seen together, Manoon and Nios became the only two confirmed limnic eruptions on record. Both shared traits that scientists could no longer ignore: volcanic ground beneath them, gas seepage feeding the deep layers, and still water that locked those gases under pressure. To imagine these lakes was to imagine reservoirs that looked safe but held hidden chemistry, each requiring only the wrong disturbance to transform into killers. The realization was sobering. Cameroon's highlands contained several such crater lakes, and Nios had shown, with devastating clarity, that what had seemed extraordinary was instead part of a repeating pattern. Yet it was not just local maps that drew attention. Hundreds of miles away, on the border of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, sits Lake Kivu. Unlike Monaun or Nios, Kivu is massive. It stretches nearly 90 kilometers in length and is home to millions of people living in cities like Goma and Bukavu that hug its shoreline. Beneath its surface, scientists have measured enormous stores of both carbon dioxide and methane dissolved under pressure, making it a body of water with orders of magnitude more stored gas than the Cameroonian lakes. Compared to the small rural valleys around Nios and Monaun, Kivu's potential footprint extends across nations, infrastructure, and many millions of human lives. This scale immediately raised concern. Early research in the 1980s and 1990s produced estimates suggesting gas reserves vast enough to rival industrial accidents in scope, prompting global alarm about what might happen if Kivu ever destabilized. Later studies introduced more nuance, highlighting that its layers may be relatively stable under current conditions, and that seasonal dynamics and climate may keep the deep water stratified for centuries. Researchers have also refined gas measurements over time, reducing some of the most alarming figures that once circulated. Nonetheless, the essential truth remains. Kivu contains massive gas stores. It has been measured as supersaturated in parts of its depth, and it sits beside densely populated towns. That combination explains why continuous monitoring is now in place. Unlike Nios, where farmers lived in dispersed villages, Kivu's population density makes it unique among potential limnic systems. Fishing fleets line its shore, entire cities sit within sight of its waters, and its basin straddles two nations. The risk, therefore, is assessed not with sensationalism, but with careful attention. Studies weigh volcanic inputs, seismic threats, and the role of methane extraction. Debate persists. Some models suggest stability for long spans, while others remind that tectonic shifts in the Rift Valley or underwater volcanic activity could upset the balance more quickly. That uncertainty is precisely why Kivu remains such a focus of limnological research today. In this case, engineering is not a matter of pure prevention, but of use and adaptation. The methane stored within Kivu is tapped to generate electricity, a practice that both harvests energy and reduces gas content in certain zones of the lake. The principle recalls Nios, removing gas-rich water from depth and releasing it under controlled conditions. But at Kivu, the process is designed to provide benefit alongside safety. It is not an easy solution. Technology, financing, and political conditions complicate it. But the very fact that the lake's gas can function as both hazard and resource marks a difference from the calm but deadly reservoirs in Cameroon. Kivu is special for its size and population, but awareness has spread further. After Nios, the international community began to re-evaluate other crater lakes. In Iceland, some volcanic lakes have been studied for stratification and volcanic gas. In parts of Europe, sensors monitor deep alpine lakes susceptible to gas buildup, though seasonal mixing often prevents dangerous accumulation. These monitoring projects continue not because eruption is expected shortly, but because Nios illustrated how silence can disguise risk. Once, limnic eruption earned a place in scientific vocabulary. A new category of hazard entered global watch lists. This shift shows in preparedness. Before 1986, emergency manuals listed earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, even volcanic ash, but not suffocating lakes. Afterwards, conferences began to include limnic events alongside natural hazards, Scientists installed monitoring devices in suspect lakes, collaborated with governments, and created frameworks for assessing invisible risks. The transition from unthinkable to rare but real is part of NEOS's legacy. Today, where stratified volcanic lakes exist, particularly in Africa, but also in Europe and Asia, conversations about safe settlement are no longer theoretical. A key point is rarity. Only 2 limnic eruptions are confirmed: Monon in 1984, Neos in 1986. Their impact was catastrophic for the communities involved, but the events remain extraordinary against the backdrop of daily life. Many lakes, even volcanic ones, never accumulate dangerous gas. Seasonal mixing often prevents it. Geology may not supply enough, and depth may be insufficient. Scientists emphasize this nuance. Most lakes are safe, yet the handful with specific traits, deep basins, volcanic seams, thermal stratification, deserve heightened attention. Vigilance is guided not by frequency, but by consequence. Still, rarity complicates communication. To live every day with worry over a 1 in a million chance would overwhelm people. Authorities, therefore, balance awareness with reassurance. Most lakes require no fear. A short list is known and monitored. That balance is evident at Kivu, where families still fish and farm as generations have, while data towers and sampling lines hum in the background. The presence of instruments rather than the absence of life is the reminder of danger there. Standing at Kivu, you may see fishing boats scattering out under dawn mist, children carrying bundles of wood, markets stirring toward day. The lake looks like any other vast body of fresh water, nourishing lives and economies. Beneath, the chemistry is entirely different, heavy with gas under pressure. Above, research stations track its shifts. The juxtaposition is emblematic: surface calm, hidden hazard, and human vigilance acting as mediator between the two. Other nations, far from Africa, have also learned to check their volcanic lakes. Iceland has projects watching geothermal systems, Japan has studied gases in caldera lakes, and small pockets in Europe use sensors to guard against silent buildup. These efforts are not reactions to imminent threats, but acknowledgments of possibility. Once a risk is proven, even in rare form, oversight becomes part of global precaution. NEOS turned what looked like pastoral scenery into a global safety category. Awareness itself became a form of defense. The mirror is clear. Monon foreshadowed NEOS, proving that gas could be stored invisibly. NEOS magnified the lesson with tragedy on a larger scale. Kivu represents the horizon of concern, demonstrating that larger bodies of water with greater populations nearby cannot be ignored. And across continents, scientists now acknowledge that stratified crater lakes deserve monitoring. That is the trajectory from event to understanding to practice. What remains most striking is how little the senses assist. Villagers at Nios saw still water, heard quiet nights, smelled nothing unusual. At Kivu, fishermen looking out on smooth ripples see no threat. Only instruments, gas sensors, stratification measurements, sampling rigs reveal the hidden character. That reliance on technology reflects a shift in trust from instinct to data. It is not a comfortable shift, but one shaped by necessity. So the story travels from Cameroon's valleys to Rwandan and Congolese cities to Icelandic and European research outposts. It shows how one catastrophe can reframe thinking far beyond its region. Limnic eruptions remain rare, but their potential commands respect because silence disguises them so well. The response? Pipes, monitors, energy extraction, global cooperation is not dramatic, but continuous. It's that quiet maintenance that lowers the chance of another night like Nyos. And perhaps this is the subtle line carrying forward. Nature's stillness can unsettle as much as its roar. It may be calm water, it may be an unmoving night, it may be a silence that offers no clue. Those are the moments when only science stands between the appearance of safety and the reality of danger. It is in that silence that vigilance matters most, because human senses alone cannot warn us. Which brings the story closer to its final reflection, not on the drama of eruptions, but on the quieter truths they leave behind. Sometimes what matters most is not the spectacle we prepare for, but the whispers we almost ignore. What nature whispers, we must answer. The lesson of Lake Nyos wasn't fire, ash, or shaking earth. It was the quiet undoing of air itself. Disaster arrived not with spectacle, but as a silent call to pay attention in new ways. Our safety doesn't rely only on the loud signals. Sometimes it's the slow rhythms, the chemistry hidden in water, the pauses nature keeps beneath the surface, that matter most. With patience and steady work, that lesson became action. Pipes, sensors, and ongoing watchfulness changed a silent danger into a guarded peace. If you're still here, let me know where you're listening from, or if you've ever seen a lake that felt a little mysterious to you. And if these quiet stories help you find rest, consider subscribing. It helps keep these gentle whispers reaching more ears. Now, let the story fade into the soft sounds of the night. Breathe deep. Feel the quiet grow, and let the ambient sounds carry you through until morning. Good night.